is John Pauly. I'm a professor and chair of journalism and media studies. And this is my group, Journalism 1964, Journalism Practicum class. So we're delighted that we have a chance to participate in this year's O'Brien Fellows program. Before we get started talking to our journalists, I'd like to introduce a few important guests and ask you to help me express our appreciation to them. We're lucky again this year to be joined by Peter and Patricia Frechette, who created the Barry and Alicia O'Brien Fellowship in honor of Pat's parents. And so if you could just wave and let us tell you all. It's an amazing program. People all over the country now call us and ask us how we did it, how could we do something like this. And we're also lucky this year to have some of the Diederich family. The Diederich gift, 10 years ago now we were talking about, has been an absolutely transformative gift for this college. It allowed us to do things in terms of the building, the facilities, the kind of people we hire, the kind of support that we give to students and faculty that is the envy of many schools across the country. So we're lucky to have Mary, to have Charlie, to have Michael, to have Clint. Could you just wave and So what we're going to do, I checked all of D2 out. You guys did terrific questions for our guests today. So I'm going to introduce the guests in a second, but I'm only going to ask one question, then we're going to open it up to whatever kind of questions you want to ask and see where the conversation goes. So I'm going to start from your left, Justin George from the Baltimore Sun, Brandon Lewis from the Arizona Republic, Raquel Rutledge from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Liz Navratil from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Miranda Spivack, an independent journalist formerly with the Washington Post, Marjorie Balbin, also an independent journalist but writes for the Post, and Dave Umhoefer from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Please join me in welcoming them. So I thought we'd start with a quick, easy question, which is we have a room full of students, many of whom are freshmen, many of whom are at the beginning of thinking about a journalism career. So for each of you, if you could just say in a minute or so, what got you interested in journalism? How did your career start? You want to start, Justin?
Sure. Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here, honored to be in front of all of you, and thank you for this wonderful fellowship. Really quickly, my father worked at the Denver Post. He was a mailer. Somebody put ads in the newspaper. And I think because of that, I would read the paper. He worked the graveyard shift, and every morning before I went to school, I would always read the sports section. So I got into it there, but I don't think that sealed the deal. It wasn't until high school, second semester, when I didn't know what to do with my time after playing high school sports, football season was over. I knew I liked to write, and I saw an ad in the local weekly small paper that said sports intern wanted, and I figured, well, why not? I'll just apply for that. So I did, and I didn't have any newspaper clips, or I wasn't on the school paper yearbook, and I applied with my just high school papers, and then at the end of it, a couple weeks went by, and I didn't hear back. I finally called the editor, and I said, hey, just wanted to check in on the job. And then the editor said, oh, yeah, you got it. And I go, I got it. And he goes, yeah, nobody else applied. That was my first foray into journalism, and I fell in love with it.
Brandon.
I remember getting the same question when I was in beginning reporting in college. And what I said was that I knew from a young age that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't really trust myself to do it and make a living at it, and I figured I was too lazy to actually do it if somebody didn't have a deadline for me. So 30 years later, that remains the reason I got into it, but I quickly realized that what was really interesting about the job was getting to learn something new every day. And over time, I've realized that the most fulfilling thing for me is to be telling stories from the point of view of the people most affected. In the context of the story I've worked on this last year is, I'm writing about water scarcity in the Southwest. And so I've been able to spend time in the homes of Navajos who don't have water that they once had and they have to drive 50 miles to get it. Farmers in the Rockies who are worried about losing their businesses. People in Los Angeles who are now putting buckets in their showers to capture the first few minutes of cold water before it turns. So that's what's really fulfilling to me, is that I write a lot about science, but I'm able to spend time with the people who are most affected by these issues and tell it from their viewpoint.
Raquel, what got you interested?
Well, I think, can you hear me on this? Yeah? Oh, okay, good. I come from a family, I didn't have anybody in the newspaper business in my family, but my relatives are rich storytellers from the South. The way they tell stories verbally is just, they're very gifted. And I've never really had the talent to do that in a verbal way like they can, but I've always felt like I could write something, or I wanted to write a story and tell stories. So that's sort of what got me interested in it in the first place. But when I got out of school, I found it very difficult to find actually a writing job at a newspaper or a magazine or anything of the nature. So I started at a little radio station in Wisconsin, which played polka music in the morning and classic country music in the afternoon. It's a very odd combination radio station, but it's little, and they let me do a little bit of news now and then. And so once I started doing that, telling stories, I was hooked on that, and I went from there to television and then into newspapers in Colorado Springs, and started there, and just have found that it's amazing to tell stories about what's going on in people's lives and being able to affect change and have an impact.
Liz, you're the youngest of our O'Briens in the history of the program, so this is relatively recent for you. How did you get into it?
I knew from a young age that I really liked writing and wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. I thought about journalism, I thought about education, and when I was in high school, we had a very good student newspaper. And I remember competing with one girl. We both wanted to be editor-in-chief, have it for the college application, as sad as that sounds. And we ended up both interning for the Little Town Weekly, where we were doing stories about people's rhubarb pie and what gifts they got for Valentine's Day. And throughout all of that, I think it sort of became addicting, as weird as that sounds. There's something very gratifying about meeting a new person every day, about not knowing what you're getting into. And then fast forward, working at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, I think I realized I made the right choice for me. We were covering our police chief, who we broke news that he and others had been working to steal money from the Bureau, and what's crazier than a story about a police chief committing a crime. So seeing how digging and asking the right questions can expose things that are going on and create change in the community was so rewarding and so gratifying that I think I did the right then. Just wanted to keep on going.
My story's a little bit different. I actually did grow up in a newspaper family. I grew up in the Washington area. My dad was a Washington correspondent for the New York Post we like to say when it was a real newspaper. And it did have a very fabled heyday in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, actually. And some people will know that here. Others will think it's kind of the slimeball tabloid. But anyway, so my father actually encountered some problems in the early 60s when there was a lot of adoring coverage of John F. Kennedy. I think there's no other way to put it. And it wasn't really critical but he was a sort of an iconoclast in a way. He had done aggressive reporting in Albany and in New York, writing about a guy named Frank Costello, who was a big crime boss in New York. And so, this guy comes along, John F. Kennedy, and actually, and this of course came out later, that his dad had some organized crime connections, and a lot of stuff just did not get looked at. There was this new era in the United States. And so, but my father sort of knew all that. And so he was sort of a thorn in Kennedy's side at the press conferences, which were the first live TV press conferences then. Eisenhower's were all taped and then rebroadcast. And so that didn't go too well for him, because the owner of the New York Post, Dorothy Schiff, who it later came to light was a paramour of John F. Kennedy, but that was much later, Anyway, they gave him a hard time, and they wanted to bring him back to New York. And you know, it's one of these kind of terrible situations that you sort of want to avoid in journalism, which is an owner with whom you don't agree. So he quit, and I was young, and I was just like, I'm not going into this business. Forget this. And so eventually, though, I went to college and got a summer job on a small newspaper in Maine and had a fantastic editor, one of the best I've ever had in a very long career, which kind of tells you something also about the business. And I was like, okay, I'm hooked. This is great. I see why my father did this. This is a wonderful profession. You get to ask people. You get to talk to strangers. You get to do what, you know, as people have said here, you don't know what's going to happen every day. It's you know, for people with short attention spans, it's a fabulous profession. Anyway, and that was it. I was in, and then I got out of college and I got my first job in a small newspaper in Massachusetts, and it's been sort of onward from there. I have to say I had one other fellowship in my career. I had a Ford Foundation grant and went to Yale Law School for a year, which I would also just, you don't have to go to law school, but anything you can do to steep yourself in law and journalism together will really pay off in your career. You know, if you just take the media law class or a good media law class somewhere that, you know, is useful to you. So anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking with it.
Well, like Raquel, I was into stories, but not into telling stories. I was always interested in other people's stories. I wanted to know everyone's business. I was a real inquisitive kid. My mother would say that I was really nosy. And so I had questions about everything. Why was this way? Why was this that way? I grew up, just for part of my younger life, in Haiti, where there is no free press. And so I would see things that were just so outrageous, and I didn't understand why those things were as they were. And so every time we would leave church on Sundays, there'd be all these poor women who would be begging you to take their children because they couldn't feed them. And they would just say, look at my baby, it's so beautiful, don't you want it? And I would ask my mother, why? Why are these women trying, don't they love their children? And my mother was always so ashamed and embarrassed. She kept trying to protect me from this stuff. And then you would see people, well, they didn't have a free press, and so reporters would disappear, they'd get beaten. And I was just always questioning things that I saw that were wrong and that I didn't understand why they were allowed to exist. And I left Haiti as a 6-year-old and I came to the US. And, you know, I wanted to be a pediatrician because I wanted to take care of all these little sick babies. And somehow I fell into journalism, but those memories always stayed with me. You know, these people who had no voice, people who had no rights, people who couldn't change their life circumstances, people who lived in a society that there was no government accountability at all. And every time I thought about them, I kept saying, you know, I wanted to write about people like that. And so when I got my first job, you know, I brought all these memories with me into the newsroom. And I've spent much of my career writing about the human condition, writing about income inequality, before that was even a buzz term, writing about people who were powerless and voiceless, and trying to right wrongs on a social issues kind of basis. And that's what I ended up doing this fellowship on. And so my project was on income inequality and welfare reform. And I've been spending the last year with a bunch of welfare mothers to see if they've been able to break the cycle. And that was something also that was my interest based on my background, because when you come from a poor country, people are born into a circumstance and it's almost impossible to get out. You know, I mean, there are people who do, but there's so many people who don't. And you know, it's a perpetuating cycle of poverty. And in countries like that, there's a reason for it, because that's the system and there's no social programs. But I was very interested in why it's in a country like this, the richest country in the world. You know, it might as well be Mars compared to, you know, the life people have in Haiti, and why there's some persistent poverty in the US was very compelling to me. And so even though I've covered crime, I've covered housing, I've covered government and social welfare policies, across all of those beats, it's been an interest. The thread has been, you know, looking at poverty and how people can get out of it, and why it's so hard to break. And so now I'm looking at the children of welfare moms from the 1996 welfare reform law. So next year it'll be 20 years, and so I'm going out and trying to find if they've been able to break the cycle of poverty. And so that's where I am.
Thank you. Dave.
I'm going to go way back in time. I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I had an English teacher, a priest in high school, who encouraged me to enter an essay contest. And I submitted an essay called The Advantages and Disadvantages of Size 13 Feet. And I won, and there they are. So I started writing. Apparently I had some ability to do it, and I pursued that. And then Watergate happened. The scandal, Richard Nixon's downfall, Woodward Bernstein, the movie, the book, All the President's Men. See it if you haven't seen it. I've got a dog-eared copy on my nightstand. I probably have read it 20 times. I've been really fortunate to get into the business of covering government and following the rich and powerful and holding them accountable. Every day is different. It's like going to grad school every day. It's really a thrill for me to be kind of the people's representative, and there's fewer of us now, more people to cover, so I hope we can talk about that later today too. But I was just inspired to get into it by events in the world, and lucky enough to pursue it and keep doing it.
Thank you. So let's open this up to questions from the students. So what I'd like you to do is two things. First, when you raise your hand and you get called on, state your name so we know who you are. And then second, as much as possible, keep your question focused and succinct. So who wants to start? Jack, please. Jack.
Yeah, do you want me to start? Okay, so I have a question on Jack this, and I have a question for Dave. I know when I heard you speak last, you were very focused on Walker. And without Walker dropping out, has that changed your plan on the project?
That's a great question. The question is, did Governor Walker dropping out of the presidential race change my project? Changed my life, perhaps. I had prepared a lengthy series of biographical stories on the governor, and he dropped out in untimely fashion before those stories ran. But he's still governor, and he's still an extremely important person in the state. And even if he wasn't governor, I'm looking at his Act 10 law, the collective bargaining changes, and how they're playing out in schools. So the legacy of whatever good, bad, or indifferent things have happened in education due to that law change are worth looking at, no matter if he's governor or not. So the answer is really no, but it's caused me to have to juggle some other things. So we're actually going to kind of shoehorn some of that earlier work that I did on his career into some of the stories in the fellowship, which, you know, part of it is looking at the history of labor unions and the teachers union, and the kind of the political ups and downs, the fights between the Republicans and unions. So I'll be able to use a lot of the material in that. Thanks for caring.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Walter. I have a question for Miranda. I'm wondering, you mentioned that it's very important to study law and kind of have a background in law, but are there any other fields that journalists should study these days that will help?
Well, I think anything, frankly, science, anything related to health. I mean, there's going to be massive stories in this country in the next 5 years about the impact of health care changes in the law and how that's going to change both, you know, the professions, medical profession in a lot of ways. But, you know, frankly, I mean, I've edited and I've been a reporter, and I think, you know, what you're always looking for in new reporters is, are they inquisitive? Do they not take no for an, you know, and if somebody says no to you, do you keep pushing? That would be a good thing to do. You know, are you accurate? Are you a decent writer? You don't have to be a great writer. We can help you with that, but we can't help you with the reporting. If you don't get the facts right, you know, we were talking about hidden time bombs in stories that are sometimes very hard to see. So, you know, That's what I think people are really still looking for, whether it's digital or in print.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah.
Because I also think, to piggyback on that, science for sure, math, algebra. I am working on a story right now that is killing me. I got through high school and college somehow with no chemistry, zero chemistry, and I'm having to write stories about molecular formulas and mass and volume and all these different weights and doing algebraic equations and calculus. It's insanity, and it's. If I wish I had a little bit of background on that. I'm relying on experts. Don't worry. Absolutely verifying a lot with a lot of people, but it just makes life a lot more challenging. It would be a lot easier if I had some background, a little better in science.
Also, I'd like to add economics and also demographics. I mean, this country is changing so much. Also, a big area of interest is the graying of America. We're going to have more people aging, which kind of has to do with the health care. We have so much people who are going to be elderly, so there's going to be a huge labor shift. So all those, I think, and I think economics is really important as well.
I'd like to add to that too. I think in this sort of media landscape these days, having a second degree or any sort of specialty is the fastest way you can get up, not have to follow the traditional path that a lot of us have had to follow, which is all paper and then get to bigger paper or whatever. When you have a specialty, when you know law or you know health, especially, that's the quickest way to get to a lot of the online outlets like, Huffington Post, things like that, getting noticed by the New York Times. So I would say, any type of specialty, if you can be an expert yourself and be able to sort of have a niche, that's probably the most important thing that you can do these days, because that's what, everything sort of come to with the internet. With so much content out there, they want people who are able to explain really complex things.
Could I add one thing there? Become fluent in a second language. Yes. Absolutely. Keep going with the language classes. Travel overseas. Newsrooms have a lot of problems with diversity, of course, and it's sort of surprising how few Spanish speakers there are, for instance, in newsrooms, and that looks really good on the resume.
Hey, Greg Browski spoke to us last time and said he's looking for reporters who can do more than one thing. Mm-hmm. So all of these are great examples. Another question. Oh, you did a question.
I was just going to ask, out of curiosity, what did you all study in college? Did you major in your own?
Let's just go right down the list. Really.
College?
What did you study, Dave?
Journalism.
Me too.
No, history.
English, French, and African studies. Go figure that one.
Journalism and economics.
Journalism and history.
Journalism and ethnic studies.
Interesting combination. Who's got a question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Maggie Cannon, and I actually have a question for Justin. I know you did a lot of work with the Adnan Syed murder story and the Cyril podcast, and I was just wondering if you could talk about your experience with that and how it differs from other projects.
Sure. I was a contributor to Cyril, which is the podcast that became sort of a phenomenon. I sort of lucked my way into that. Working with Sarah Koenig, who was the producer and the narrator of that, was just an incredible experience that I saw, honestly, her reporting with different senses and how important it is to gather sort of you talk about context, you talk about doing background work and things like that, but you don't think about other things like, just what a schoolroom is like, sort of the description of, a place, the distances. She would measure exactly how far the gravesite was from the road, and then conveying that, to the listener. And the biggest thing that I learned, and why it may have struck a chord with the public is a couple of things. And one is that it focused on our criminal justice system, and it showed just, sort of the flaws within it. The case itself, when you look at it legally, is not that extraordinary. But then when you sort of dive into it and see what's going on, what kind of defense people are getting, the issues of evidence, what's being tested, what's not, then you realize, and you have somebody's obviously life at risk here, you're talking about life in prison, then you sort of look at the criminal justice system a bit differently and a little bit more critically, and you wonder, wow, is this really what it's like? Second of all, I think what traditional journalists have done is that we would have the same sort of discussions that Sarah had on her podcast, which was, trying to figure out whether somebody's telling the truth or, essentially what this sort of piece of evidence means. And those are discussions that we would have in our newsroom with our editors. Well, she decided to just take all of that and just put it on the airwaves. And, what we call, hearing how the sausage is made. Well, actually, we've always thought that the public didn't want to hear that and didn't want to know anything about it. But actually, transparency and understanding the processes of reporting, fascinated the public. So if anything, giving the public more about our processes in order, to find stories and to tell stories were very important, and that's something that I took away from. I hope that helps. Thank you. Good question.
Yes. Hi, Mark Tyson. I have a question for Miranda. Sorry, I'm back a little bit of this quick, so you stated that you grew up in a journalism family. Your family was in the newspapers. I grew up in a family filled with engineers, so they all like math, and I didn't. So what advantages or disadvantages would you say growing up in a family?
Oh, wow. Well, my childhood was very cool. Eugene McCarthy came to dinner at our house.
Wow.
And he was just a senator. He wasn't running for president at that time. I got to go to the White House as a kid and meet Lyndon Johnson. So, I had some really fabulous experiences just that I thought were normal. So that was, a little weird. But, and I lived in Washington. So, there are a lot of kids who were similarly situated, or somebody's father was in the CIA or whatever. It was just an interesting, odd place to grow up. I think what I saw in probably both my parents, my mother became a college professor eventually, but is that, there's a great amount of skepticism and not believing what is presented to you. And it didn't matter whether it was something in the neighborhood or work, just to be very observant about what's going on around you, trying to understand people's motives and hidden agendas. And, I think I just sort of absorbed that as a kid. So, I feel lucky. I lost my dad. I was 18. He died. And I think some of that, frankly, was the stress of this profession. And that was another reason why I wasn't sure I was going to go into it. But you know what? I would just say find something you love. And if it's journalism, that's great. And if it's engineering, that's fabulous. You'll make more money than I will ever make. And if you're falling out of what your family is doing, that's cool too.
So maybe just to build on Mark's question a little bit, do you have any advice? Because a number of us have to explain to our parents why we choose the thing that we do. Why we choose to go into journalism.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a tough one.
I set out to be an engineer.
It's a tough one these days.
This is where I ended up.
I feel like journalism is a calling, that you have to be passionate about, you have to have curiosity about the world, you have to want to know what makes other people tick. How did that person get from here to there? Why are things the way they are? What do you want our culture to be like? Or, how come you don't see politicians that are in the image that you want to see them in? I felt like no matter what I was going to do, I ended up being a journalist because I was meant to be. I majored in biology till my junior year, and my parents were so disappointed when I said I didn't want to be a doctor, that I wanted to be a journalist. And if you come from a culture where that's not even respected, where journalists get disappeared all the time, and they're just considered, that you're either being paid by the government or being paid by someone else. They're just not a free and rigorous press. But every time I tried to do something else, I wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to know about people. And I remembered I called my older sister, and I was in tears, and I was like, I really don't want to be a doctor. Plus, I was squeamish. And I kept thinking, every time I had to dissect an animal, I would just wanted to barf. And if I see anybody else barf, I'd run. And I was like, I can't do this. And so, I think that the journalists who are the best journalists are the ones who are passionate about it, who love what they do, who get a kick out of doing stories. I mean, I don't get to do every great story that I want. You know, sometimes you have to do the stuff you don't feel like doing, you know, cover boring city council meetings. But if, you know, yeah, that's how I started out. But, you know, at the end of the day, I feel like I have the best job in the world because I get to meet all kinds of people. Like if I were just a pediatrician, I couldn't just get up one day and say, now I want to be a neurologist or a foot doctor. But when you're a journalist, you're an expert on everything. And so like it's like one day you're writing about the economy, the next day you're writing about something completely silly and unrelated. And even, you know, unless you have a beat. But I feel like I've gotten to cover all kinds of things. I've traveled all over the world. I've seen a lot of the country. And it's been, you know, really fulfilling for me. So.
Can I just add something to that? You know, when you talk about what you're going to do when you get out of college, I wouldn't go to law school now unless you go to one of the top 20 law schools. The job market is terrible for lawyers.
Too many lawyers.
So, you know, I mean, and that was 10 years ago, I wouldn't have given that advice. I would have said go to law school.
So. Do something you love.
Right.
Yeah,
definitely.
I'm John Hannon, and I have a question for Justin. You talked earlier about the Cyril podcast and that story, and I read one of the stories you did. You focused on the convict's family, which I thought was interesting, a unique perspective. How do you look at a story and pick a perspective that might go against the grain?
Well, I think in the case of Cyril, we wanted to, as far as the Sun's coverage of that case and of broadcasters, we wanted to complement it. We did not want to do the same thing. So, you know, I just sort of thought about it. And, you know, I think my focus in writing and being a reporter has always been to focus on people, to focus on the stories that they tell, to focus on the human drama, to focus on essentially, you know, how people are relating to each other, how our world relates to itself, and things like that. So, you know, I just thought about it for a while, and from visiting his family, you know, the first time I went in, I could just sense just how that family was torn apart. And it's very controversial to focus on somebody who's a convicted murderer and say that their family has suffered when you have a victim out there. But that also doesn't, you know, eliminate the fact that they are suffering and what they went through. So it's a very sensitive line to walk. But, you know, the first moment that I walked in there, I remember that I would meet with Adnan Syed's mom and brother, and the father would just stay in his room. And I learned that essentially he had been almost a ghost, a specter, I think I call him, a presence in the house, because he wouldn't communicate, he hardly talked to anybody. And it essentially just, you know, ruined his life. He quit his job engineering, focusing on his son, things like that. So, you know, I just sort of saw the pain there, and I wrote that story. And I revisited the family after Cyril became such a success, and all of a sudden they were having all these different fundraisers and attorneys who were helping Adnan's case, and it was a completely different place. So it's interesting that you could see sort of the difference and that you were there to sort of document it.
Hi, I'm Jenny Fisher. I just have an open question. Obviously, we have a lot of people in this room that are from a lot of different places, and I just was wondering how you guys think Milwaukee does as being a place where you can engage right for and in about.
Well, Liz, you just got here. You got any impressions about that?
I think there are some things that are going to be universal in kind of every city you go to. You're always going to run into these interesting casts of characters and people who have a story to tell. Milwaukee, I think you definitely notice the Midwestern feel when you step foot in town. People tend to be very open to chatting, definitely will take time, at least the ones I've encountered so far. Granted, I haven't been knocking on the official doors just yet, so maybe that'll change. But I think you'll notice kind of different changes in different regions. I spent a summer in Denver and comparing the officials and their open responses there to Pennsylvania, where they're like, get lost, here's our exception to the open records law. It's sort of an interesting experience. So I think one of my pieces of advice for each of you would be to intern in as many different places as you can, because you're going to get a different experience in each place. So Milwaukee so far has been very welcoming, but maybe someone who's been the whole way through the project is better to answer.
Brandon, you spent most of your time out west, right? Is that where you've grown up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Alaska, but most of my career has been in the West. I found Milwaukee to be a really fascinating city. But most of my work, of course, wasn't based here, although I'm in the process now of finishing a story that is about the Great Lakes and Milwaukee, and kind of contrasting our situation with water to a region that's water rich. And part of that story, I was able to grab onto the old story about the Rust Belt sending all the people away for decades to us in Phoenix and California and so on, and now of a potential future where people might want to drift back to where there's actually water for them. And so that's just one story that I found here that kind of speaks to universal themes throughout the country, but is very specific to this region. I think also a lot of urban issues here are very interesting. I found that not that this surprised me, because intellectually I knew it, but the segregation in this town is kind of startling. I lived, when I was here, I lived over south of UWM, and I remember walking down the street to catch the bus here one day, and there was a black woman coming out of a building, and she stopped and looked around and said, "Boy, I could live over here." I was like, wow. I mean, where I live out west, we have these issues, but it's just somehow not quite at the surface, and I don't know. I found that this was a really interesting place to be.
My name is Raquel. I just had to slip in a quick question for Raquel. You mentioned that you're from this really rich Southern background filled with these amazing storytellers. Did you ever consider a career working in publishing?
Working in publishing? No. Sorry. No. And I haven't wanted to go into editing even. It's like Marjorie said, it's one of these things that you just know when you're called to do the job you're doing. There's just no doubt. My dad tried to get me to go into, he had a medical supplies company, and he said, "Come work with me." He lived in Minneapolis, and come on, we'll have this great business together. And I spent like 2 months going into hospitals, and there's no way I can do that job. I moved to Japan, and I thought, well, I'll teach English. No, and I kept finding myself wanting to come back and write. I mean, who else would show up? You know you're desperate when you're working for a local radio station and a country music station. It's desperate. It's just something you can't get away from. So there were lots of things I could do to make a lot more money. Though, and my dad did say, "You're never going to make any money in journalism."
That was true.
No, it is not. I don't say it's not true. But again, we live in Milwaukee. Speaking of working in Milwaukee, it's much more affordable to live here and manageable. But we do make some money, and you can have a great job. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Yeah.
Again, have you thought about that as an option for you? Is that why you asked?
Yeah, right now I have a major in journalism and a double minor in PR and creative writing, so I will keep on.
Yeah, I know people in my class, University of Illinois. I know a lot of people. I suspect a lot of people from Liz's English program.
They go a lot of different directions. Another piece of advice I would have for you guys is to take some sort of basic coding classes or Excel classes so you get used to working with data. A lot of what we'll see, particularly among people I graduated with, is that a lot of the job openings are in designing interactives or data analysis or kind of different facets of the field that might not have existed years ago.
Yeah, please, Mike.
A
little bit louder.
Yeah,
sorry.
I have a question for Raquel. I read your cashing in on some of the stories in that series, and I was wondering how you found that story and what inspired you to write about that.
That story fell in my lap from a tipster who turned out later to be a whistleblower. And that doesn't happen very often in our lives, unfortunately, but when it does, it's just a huge blessing. It was somebody who was willing, who had gone up the chain and tried to complain to supervisors and to others and try to get things fixed. And in fact called our newspaper a number of times and tried to say, "Hey, here's what's going on." And just nobody was able to run with it. Nobody could make sense of it. And it's one of those things, we had systems kind of set up at the Journal Sentinel to be able to spend the time to do it. It started with a baby who died in a daycare van in the summer. That little kid was left in the daycare van in July and ended up dying. And the tipster called our newsroom one night and just said, "Hey, that baby never should have even been at that daycare that day." Well, and that in most newsrooms would have fallen through the cracks. It would have been, who's going to handle that? Because the cops reporter is running around chasing the death, talking to the family. You're handling the logistics of what goes on right then, the breaking news of the day or a couple of days. But that got emailed to me, and I had the time to call the person back and say, tell me, what are you even talking about? I have no idea. Well, how do you know this kid should not have been there? And we sat down over weeks and months and started to develop a relationship to a source where where there's trust, and then they could kind of walk me through a roadmap of where things were kind of going wrong, because it was a system I didn't know anything about. That's another thing I think Marjorie you said too, is when you get to write about stuff, it's something different all the time. Mm-hmm. I had no idea about the daycare subsidy program in Wisconsin. I would have no way to know anything about it. So it involves a lot of research and reading and figuring out how things are supposed to work, which is again why law school makes sense. So you can understand how things are supposed to happen, and then you can find out where they're going wrong, because you got to understand them first. And so that just kind of came to me, and it just ended up being one thing after the next, and it was just jaw-dropping, because you never imagined that you'd have somebody saying they're taking care of hundreds of kids and billing the state and the federal government for it when they really weren't watching anybody. All these ghost phantom operations, and the millions of dollars it ended up being, but you would never know. Just the first story I wrote was the scam was like about $30,000. It was very small, but so some people again might say, oh, that's only $30,000. I'm not going to pay attention to it. Well, if you keep on digging, it turns out it was $40 million every couple of years that was being burned on this thing.
We still have time for a couple more questions. Yeah, please.
I'm Wyatt Massey. My question specifically for Margaret, but if anyone can also answer. With dealing with sensitive issues and people's personal lives and going in for a very short time, getting to know them, then publishing about them, how do you balance doing journalism that's going to be powerful enough to make a difference, but also doing justice to the subject you're talking about?
That's really something I grapple with all the time. I still have, and even with this story that I've been working on. What I try to do is I try to withhold judgment. I try not to apply my own standards and experiences to the people that I'm reporting. I try to treat them with great respect because they're letting me in their lives. And I tell them very, very honestly, look, you're telling me some of these things that are very sensitive, that are personal, that sometimes you're not going to be well viewed. Once the story is published, you're going to be judged. People are going to say things about you. So I try to get them to understand that, especially if I'm dealing with very poor people who are not media savvy. If you're talking to the governor, you don't have to tell the governor over and over again what's going to happen. But I try to give them lots of room, and I explain to them, like, for instance, if you tell me this is going to be in the paper. If you want to tell it to me so I'll have the background, but you don't want me to use it, you have to say it's off the record. I tell them what the rules are. And then you just try to, in terms of your emotional stuff, you try to keep that in check as well. Because a lot of these people, who've been through quite a bit of stuff, they have very sad stories. They have very complicated lives. Sometimes they've made really bad decisions that have gotten them in the place they are. And sometimes these things happen through no fault of their own. And so I try not to judge them when I think what they've done is, reckless or careless or irresponsible. And also, I don't, like I said, I don't apply my own standards. This whole concept of objectivity that you guys learn about, I think that now that in our circles, we know that it's not just, you can't be purely objective, because by virtue of what you leave out of the story and what you put in, these are all subjective decisions, right? So I always just think about, how would I want to be treated? How can I be fair? And you can't help but have your own kind of perceptions. But if you're trying to tell a larger story that's not about you, then you have to constantly keep that in mind. I just spent a year with some of these women, and the last day I was here, I took all of them out because I wanted them all to meet each other, because I had seen so many parallels in their lives. And it turns out two of these moms, these welfare moms, their children were best friends that they had never met. And they used to drop their kids off at each other's homes. But I also thought they could help each other. I didn't feel like there was any kind of conflict. But I said to them, I spent a year just constantly in your lives, asking you deeply personal questions about domestic abuse, about, sexual abuse, about wrong decisions, about, ending up in homeless shelters. And I said, I really thank you for that. I'm going to write these stories, and I hope that I do justice to your stories, but that they will have some parts that will be very hard for them to read, for them to see themselves in the way that they're portrayed. And so, did I answer the question? Yeah, okay.
One last brief question. Anybody? Please.
Hi, I'm John Grove. I have a question for Liz. I've lived in Pittsburgh my whole life, and so I remember when the story by the police chief broke, with something that large in the company's Inequality, were you ever apprehensive about where it might be because there might be blowback against you?
Blowback is a daily part of covering crime. To some extent, you kind of get used to it. I think with that particular series, it was so big and it unraveled so slowly, and we had so many of us involved in it. There were about 4 of us who were working on it, 2 of us primarily doing most of it with the police side. That you kind of knew you always had another reporter to run things off of if you wanted to figure out how you were wording a question and making sure you're not getting your source in a jam. Things like that. I think if you're doing the job right, you kind of have to accept that you're going to anger some people at a different time, and you just have to brace yourself for it. Make sure you've crossed all of your T's, dotted all of your I's to be as fair as you can, and also, done everything you can to protect your sources. So I think that was an interesting one because it was kind of very clear cut that what he was doing was wrong. I mean, nobody's going to say stealing from the Bureau is, woo, good job. So that was kind of a different one, but I think where you run into that in some other issues is when you're writing about these guys who are in difficult circumstances and figuring out, what's the effect going to be on them.
So I want to thank, first of all of you as students, because you did such a good job preparing the questions. I really appreciated that. Thanks to the O'Brien Fellows, it's just been a transformative experience the last few years to have working journalists hanging out with us, talking. We've learned a lot from that, and it's created some opportunities for you to look forward to as journalism majors. I'm sure the O'Briens are going to be hanging around, so if you have questions for them that you didn't get a chance to ask, I'm sure they would be happy to address those. Thanks again to Pat and Pete Frechette for this amazing gift that allows us every year now to bring journalists to us. And for the Diederich family, it's always good to see you. Feel like a family reunion, and so many doors that you've opened up to do the kind of work we do. So God bless all of you, and thank you for being here.